يسعد ويشرف اتحاد المصريين معا بالمملكة المتحدة أن يقدم لكم سلسلة ندوات تعليمية تحت عنوان معا نتعلم ونستفيد. اتحاد المصريين معا بالمملكة المتحدة أسس لجلب المنافع للإخوة المصريين في جميع أنحاء العالم، هذا بالإضافة إلى تأسيس وخلق مجتمع يساعد على تقوية الألفة بين أبناء جمهورية مصر العربية في الخارج. الهدف من هذه المبادرة هي إتاحة الفرصة لبعض من الخبراء في شتى المجالات لكي يشاركوا بمعلوماتهم وخبراتهم لتعليم وإفادة العامة عبر محاضرات تأتيكم عبر الإنترنت، من ثم ترفع المحاضرات على قناة الاتحاد على اليوتيوب. The Egyptians Together Union in the UK is honored to introduce a series of educational talks called Together Teach Each Other. The Egyptians Together Union in the UK was established to bring about mutual benefits to our fellow Egyptians all around the world, in addition to providing a community to strengthen the bond between Egyptians abroad. The purpose of this initiative is to provide the stage for professionals in a variety of different fields to share their knowledge to educate the masses live via the internet, from which the sessions are uploaded to the Union's YouTube channel. I am glad to introduce Dr. Abir Al-Alfi, that's going to talk about addiction, health, and social impacts.
All right, Assalamu alaikum. Thanks for the introduction. Before I start, I just want to make sure that you all can hear me. And
yes, loud and clear.
Okay, for some reason I cannot share the video. Hold on. Can you see me now?
Now, if you would like to start by introducing yourself and then start the talk, please.
Okay, perfect. So I'm Abir Al-Alfi, Associate Professor of Biopharmaceutical Sciences at the Medical College of Wisconsin in the United States. I graduated from pharmacy school with Dr. Walid, and that's how we know each other. My specialty is neuropharmacology with a focus primarily on neuropsych disorders. And in this case, I'm going to talk primarily about addiction. So before I start, I just want to see if what's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear the term addiction? If you would like to just put in one word when you hear the term addiction that comes to your mind, just put it in the chat, and maybe we can share it a little bit later. But one thing that comes to my mind is, so this is a quote actually from an Irish poet who is Francis Bacon. He said, a brain disease, he was talking about addiction, he suffered from alcoholism and actually ended up dying from it. He said that it's a brain disease where one is too many and 1,000 is not enough. And this quote in particular rings a bell in my mind because as simple as it is, it actually explains all of the science that we know about addiction so far. Very simple, but it really explains everything that we know about that disease. Another one is I'm addicted and I just can't get enough. That's, I don't know if any of you is like a Black Eyed Peas fans, but this was in one of their songs. But again, it says, this idea of that people, when they are addicted, cannot get enough. This is a key word. And so on. So the reality is there are so many words that patients who experience addiction express their experience, and this experience actually translates into the science behind addiction. So this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to try to make sure that we all are on the same page when it comes to the terms used in the medical field when we talk about addiction. So I will explain what is substance use disorder, which is the new classification now that addiction falls under. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens in the brain actually when a patient becomes addicted. The first time the patient uses a drug or any substance for that matter, and then how the brain transitions from just a one-time use to becoming addicted to that substance. While these brain changes are going on, I will talk about the different health and social impacts that this patient, their family, everybody related to that patient go through. And I will end with just touching on the various approaches to prevent and treat substance use disorders or addiction. So in our new, and I'm going to, The DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders, this is what we use to diagnose patients who experience many of the neuropsych disorders, including addiction. So in 2013, they transformed the definition to include what is known as substance use disorder. And if you look at the definition, the first thing that would stand out in the definition is this: it's a brain disease. And this is the first thing that we all need to acknowledge. When we talk about addiction, when we talk about a patient using substances, it is a brain disease. It is a disease that will require treatment and will require changes that happen in the brain for the patient to get better. Substance use disorder, so the minute the patient starts using a medication, using a substance, that substance use, when they start developing certain symptoms that are associated with these substance use, and then it is a substance use disorder. At the very end of that spectrum, the most intense form and the most severe form of this substance use disorder is actually addiction. If you look at the other highlighted point that I want to say is this: using takes over their life. And that's the most severe form of substance use, when the only thing that the patient wants is just to use the substance. They become obsessed with it, they become preoccupied with it, and it literally takes over their life. And that's what we're going to talk about, how socially, functionally, everything becomes centered around the use of these substances. I'm just going to put these all together. So just a few terms. So when we're talking about substance-related disorders, if you look at the DSM-5, here in the US, we have 10 drug classes that typically patients become addicted to. Alcohol, of course, is number one. Opioids, caffeine, cannabis or marijuana, hallucinogens, and inhalants. And unfortunately, chemistry keeps adding a whole bunch of new chemicals. Every time we try to make some of these substances illegal, unfortunately, the chemists modify the structure, and we end up with new street drugs that are available on the market. I just wanted to make sure that there are other addictive disorders like gambling, internet gaming, that actually made it into DSM-5. In the UK, where you guys are stationed, these are the different classes, classes A, B, and C, that include these substances. Class A, which is the majority, unfortunately, like cocaine, ecstasy, heroin, mushroom, and so on. On the right-hand corner, you see Molly, Mary Jane, Angel Dust, Special K acid. And these are actually the street names for most of these substances that patients use. Whenever I teach my students, I tell them, the patient will not come and tell you, oh, they are using amphetamine or they are using barbiturates. They will say the street names. And it is important for any healthcare professional to be aware of these street names. So let's look a little bit at the diagnosis. How exactly is a patient diagnosed with addiction or with a substance use disorder? If you look on the left side and see the criteria, they fall primarily in 4 buckets. But if you look at these 4 buckets, these are not like lab tests or imaging or any type of diagnostics that we typically use for many other disease states. It's a bit different. It's more social and behavioral aspects that these patients exhibit, and as a result, they become diagnosed with addiction or substance use disorders. So if you look at the first one, impaired control. So let's say a patient was taking an opioid, Vicodin, or any of these opioids for pain management. And instead of just using that opioid for, the pain management for the 6 months that he was supposed to use, suddenly they're asking for more. Pain is gone, and that's key. The pain is gone. They are not complaining of anything else, but now they are seeking the drug. So they are taking larger amounts for no particular medical use, but it's primarily because they have this impaired control. Social impairment, and this is a key aspect of the diagnosis, that this patient becomes socially dysfunctional. They start missing social gatherings. They are not engaged with their family or their friends. And this gradually becomes worse and worse to the point that it affects their work life. They cannot function at their work, and it takes over, as I said, it takes over their life. The risky use of substance. They know that if they drive under the influence, they will get a ticket, they can go to jail. Despite this, despite knowing that there is harmful consequence to the use of this substance, they can't stop it. They can't really stop that. And the reason for all of this is because the brain has undergone certain changes that actually cloud their judgment. They don't care what the consequence is. They don't care what harm they are putting themselves or others at, but because they became preoccupied. So this is just briefly. There are more elaborate, of course, details for the criteria, but this is just to give you a brief overview. So here in the US, it is a problem. And I think everywhere addiction has been a problem, and unfortunately, it continues to be a problem. And you will see with the numbers, unfortunately, it starts at a young age. And this is one of the take-home messages that I want to deliver. Be careful, be aware of your kids, of your family. Teenagers in particular become highly vulnerable. And unfortunately, when they start at this young age, they are more likely to become addicts and to experience this substance use disorder. So I see this all the time, robot tripping, which is the use of dextromethorphan. And that's why now it's behind the counter and you have to show an ID in order to buy. The opioid epidemic, the US has been highly affected by the opioid epidemic, and we're still trying to figure out how to reduce it. Alcohol still is a major problem in most of the westernized countries, and I think it's because of the social aspect of it and its association with socialization. So these are numbers from the NHS by the UK, the prevalence of drug dependence and drug use among adults. And unfortunately, if you look at this, it is, quite alarming. So this was published, this is the report in 2018. You can see the references at the bottom of the slide. If you look at this, the age, the proportions of adults ages 16 to 64 reporting signs of dependence. So the reality is it starts at a young age. As early as actually 14 or 15, these kids start actually experimenting with these substances and these drugs, and that becomes a major problem. If you look at the graph, the drug dependence by age, you can see that the highest percentage actually is among 16 to 24 males. So if you look at the blue bar at the very bottom, that's the highest percentage. About 12% of men between the age of 16 to 24 show actual signs of dependence. And if you look at this, any drug dependence is the blue line, but if you look immediately underneath, cannabis seems to be kicking off, and unfortunately we have the same issue in the US as well. So if you look at cannabis, highly, unfortunately with the high use, and here in the US, after the legalization of marijuana and cannabis products in many states, unfortunately, we're seeing the heavy use of cannabis on the rise, and we're seeing effects that we haven't seen before, even though cannabis has been around for hundreds or maybe thousands of years. Unfortunately, we're seeing these negative effects following the legalization. That's another talk, actually. So if we look at the US, more or less, we have the same trends in the US compared to the UK. Again, it's this age between 16 and 24 where you see the highest incidence of drug dependence or substance use, with marijuana again being the number one, like in the UK. So why is this a problem? It's a problem. The rates are high among children, among adolescents, and young adults. And unfortunately, if you look at this quote. It says, I used to think a drug addict was someone who lived in the far edges of society, wild-eyed, shaven head, and living in a filthy squat. But that was until I became one. So this is another message. Addiction and substance use disorder can affect anybody. It doesn't really differentiate between societies, between the different social or economic status. Unfortunately, anybody can be liable to become a substance use dependent and transition to addiction. So this is something that we always have to bear in mind when we talk about addiction. Unfortunately, we do have a ton of stigma against the stigmatization of patients who are using substances becomes a major problem because this social stigma actually prevents many of these patients from reaching out to find a treatment and to seek help. And that actually then they spiral into other major problems in this case. In the US, the cost is pretty high. About $740 billion a year are spent on addiction and substance use from all aspects. We're talking about health, economy, as well as. So what exactly is going on? So this is how I try to think of how the addiction starts and what goes on. So if you see at first, one use of any of these substances, and then the person now wants more, then they transition from just wanting a bit more to they really cannot have enough. Then they transition to they cannot stop the use, and finally the drug use takes over. If we translate this to what exactly happens, or medically, what do we call these terms? The reason they start using the one use is, of course, we know, the high. It makes them feel good. The high that patients get from these substances that we call substance of abuse is unmatched compared to any experience that they had in their life. And that's why they experiment with it. That's why they use it. But then brain changes happen that make them, this high is not as good as the first time. I want more in order to get that same high that they experienced the first time. And that's when they start using more because they develop what in pharmacology we say tolerance. Then nothing is enough anymore. And that's when they start abusing. Then they transition to, well, if they try to stop, they experience all of these bad symptoms. This is what we call withdrawal. If they stop using if they reach this point, the abuse, and then they try to stop using, that's when they experience all of these withdrawal symptoms and they can't stop. Finally, when it takes over, that's the stage that we call addiction. So briefly, I'm going to talk a little bit about it. So what happens? What exactly happens in the brain of these patients? A lot happens. And over the past, I think, maybe 15 to 20 years, we've had really major advances in neuroimaging. We can actually go into the brains of these patients and monitor the changes that do happen during the different stages of what we call the addiction cycle. I'm not going to go over this in detail, but the reality is the patient really, once the patient is addiction, we call this the addiction cycle, where the patient starts with just binge use and intoxication to they cannot stop because they can experience withdrawal, to finally the preoccupation and anticipation, and as a result, they become addicted. So I'm just gonna give an example. So this is a patient brought to the emergency department unresponsive except to noxious stimuli. Her friends reported, these are actual cases, the friends reported an evening of heavy drinking to celebrate 21st birthday. Unfortunately, very common to happen in Western countries. Here in the US, that's how most of these kids celebrate their 21st birthday. They go and binge drink, unfortunately. And then these are the symptoms that this patient had. The reality is what this patient is having is just the one-time use, the first use. So what happens in this one-time use? And if we look at the brain, so this is the brain. The one-time use, the first-time use of these substances activates this blue part of the brain. What exactly is this blue part? This is the part actually that's responsible for the high. This is what makes them feel good. And again, the high that they experience is because a certain chemical in the brain is released that makes them feel elated and high. This is different than the high that you get when you eat chocolate, for example, you know, very different. It's so intense. They have never experienced anything like it before. It doesn't really match any other reward experience that they had. And unfortunately, it happens so quickly, but it also goes away fast. And that's what makes them want more. That's the beginning of, oh, let's try another round. Let's try, you know, instead of just one joint of cannabis or pot, they're going to go for 2, 3, and it goes on. So this is another patient, MT. We're going to stay with MT for a bit. So this is a 45-year-old man who drinks alcohol almost daily, you know, over the past 7 years. His wife is concerned that she thinks he is drinking too much, and now he started missing family get-together. So now this drinking actually started to affect the social life of that patient, and his wife is concerned. However, the patient says, it's not really affecting me. I am productive at work, and I can quit anytime. He says that he has gone cold turkey, he stopped drinking, and he really didn't really have any problems, no symptoms of withdrawal. So this patient, because of the continued use, this is not the one-time use that the 21st-year-old experienced. This is now abuse. This is now, he just can't get enough. He keeps drinking, taking more. He can still stop. So that's, you know, still in that stage of the binge intoxication, but it is cannot have enough. But certain brain changes happen that transition that patient to he cannot have enough. The next visit, guess what? It's not that he can just have enough. Now he can't stop. That same patient, the next visit is very different. The wife is complaining that now he's experiencing sadness, withdrawal, going into depressive states. And the reason the patient is going through this is he's trying to quit. He's trying not to drink. But when he does that, he experiences all these negative symptoms, the withdrawal, the sadness, and now the patient transitioned to cannot stop the use. Now, when the patient transitions to this, so if you remember the first part, when the patient was just using, even when the patient was during this binge intoxication, it was this blue part of the brain that was affected, this circuit. Now the patient is transitioning to a different circuit. The brain now goes into this red circuit, which for us as neuropharmacologists, we say, this is the circuit that's responsible for stress and high alert anxiety. This is the circuit that makes the patient feels bad. This is the withdrawal phase. If they cannot have their fix, if they cannot have their substance, they are anxious, stressed, it doesn't feel good. In addition to this, depending on the substance that they are using, they can have different symptoms. Alcohol, for example, the patient experiences what we call delirium tremens. They can be delirious, they can have they can have seizures, they can have all the way to convulsions and seizures. So it's really different depending on the type of substance that the patient is using, the symptoms of this withdrawal is. Now at this point, the patient is going to go back and use the substance. Their motivation to use the substance now is very different than before. Before they're using because they want to get the high. They want to get that nice feeling that they have when they use the substance. But now they transition to, it's not the high that they want. They just want to avoid the withdrawal. They want to avoid these negative feelings that they have when the drug is not, or when the substance is not on. So this is the key, and this is the actual brain region that's involved. As I mentioned, it's very different from one drug to another, from one substance to another, very specific. One of the things, and this is when the patient experiences what we call the craving for the drug. This is just a comparison between alcohol versus cocaine withdrawal. Cocaine is notorious for the craving. Most patients, their main problem with cocaine withdrawal is actually the craving. It just takes over to the point that they crave it so much and they ended up using a lot, and unfortunately many of them end up in the emergency department. So that's from just use to abuse. And now the patient, this is another patient, this is OV, 35-year-old, but look at this. Now, it's not just that the patient cannot stop taking this substance or using this substance. Now it's affecting, and not just, they don't just miss social gatherings. Now this patient hardly attend morning meetings. Now this patient doesn't just drink alcohol. So if you look at this patient, drank alcohol, used cocaine 3 to 4 times a week actually, and occasionally uses tina and bath salts. Tina is actually crystal meth, and bath salt is one of these synthetic, unfortunately, synthetic stimulants that are available on the market. So unfortunately, they just don't stop using, it's not enough for them to use one substance. Many times they experiment with other substances as well. And in this case, it's just a mixture. But now this patient is transitioned from not just that they can't stop using, but now hardly attend morning meetings. Been trying to cut down for the past 6 months without success, so that definitely withdrawal. And now the patient admits all he can think of is how to get coke, which is cocaine. This means that it has taken over. That's when the patient transitions to actually the stage of addiction, the preoccupation and anticipation. And the problem is this: when the patient transitions to this part of the preoccupation and anticipation, that becomes a problem because they are willing to do anything to get the substance. And by anything, I mean criminal activity, stealing, killing, whatever it is. They do not mind because their brain now is taken over by this circuit that basically, you see this green one, that basically brings back all of these memories that are related to the use of the substance. And all the patient is focused on is just give me the drug, give me that substance. That's all their life is centered around, is just the substance. And this is where it becomes very tricky, because this circuit, this brain part has been activated. And unfortunately, once it's activated, there are so many triggers that will trigger the patient to start using, even if the patient quit before, even if the patient, actually has been successful in quitting. The problem is this: many other factors can actually trigger the use again. And that's why you will see when patients, are rehabilitated, or when patients go to rehabilitation, what happens is this: they need to really avoid the triggers. They need to avoid the friends that they used to smoke with. They need to avoid passing by the street where it has, the bar that they used to go to all the time, or avoid all of the parties where they used to use cocaine. That's the reality, because all of these can become cues and triggers that will throw the patient back into that loop of using, abusing, and going back. Now remember, these brain circuits are on now. This is the key. Once the patient becomes an addict, unfortunately, we have this saying, once an addict, always an addict. The problem, yes, because the brain changes have happened. These brain changes, unfortunately, are not that reversible. We cannot reverse the brain back to its normal. We cannot reset it to the normal baseline value before using. All we're trying to do is just suppress these brain circuits to make sure that the patient can quit and actually lead a good quality of life. So this is now the transition that has happened. All of these circuits are now sort of like lit up in the brain, and the patient goes into the binge intoxication, withdrawal, occupation, and goes into this cycle. Unfortunately, this is the case for most patients who experience this. So what are the risk factors? I mean, we have so many unanswered questions. We have no idea why some patients can start the road to addiction with the first sip of alcohol versus others, you know, they drink a lot and they don't really transition to that alcoholism and addiction, or it takes them a longer time. There is a genetic component, and there are multiple genes that have been identified that can tie patients to being at higher risk of addiction with substance use. I just want to highlight again one point. 9 out of 10 diagnosed with substance use disorder and addiction started using before the age of 18. And this is key. Be careful, take care of your kids, because when they start using before the age of 18, unfortunately, they are on the road to that high use, abuse, and eventually addiction. They become more vulnerable. And it makes perfect sense because unfortunately, and actually until the age of 25, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that's responsible for making decisions and making sure that you have good judgment, hasn't fully developed. In most cases, we don't fully develop the prefrontal cortex until the age of 25. So yes, if they start before the age of 18, their brain is still developing. And unfortunately, these brain changes will happen faster, and these patients or these kids become more vulnerable to addiction. So very briefly, well, how do we approach the problem? I personally go for this, prevention. This is the key. Don't wait to talk to your kids about the harmful effects of any substance use. Don't wait to talk to them about it. The key is prevention, because once it starts, it's this spiral road that's very hard to get out of, unfortunately. Family, school, peer, neighborhood, this is important. The key word that I like to use, and actually many people in the field use, is bonding. We get our reward, we get our feeling of happiness and reward from bonding with society, with families, from fitting in. And many of us, you know, who live far away from our extended families, who live far away from our homes, it's hard for our kids because it's very hard for them. They try to fit in. They are trying to hold on to our culture, but at the same time, they have the peer pressure and they want to fit in, which becomes really hard. If they don't feel that bonding, unfortunately, they seek it in something else. And that something else can be a substance use, which is a major issue, because once the substance use starts, unfortunately, the patient goes through all of these stages that I talked about. Then, so what about treatment? Yes, there are treatment modalities. And when we talk about treatment modalities, we want to prevent and treat withdrawal, because this is key. This is why the patient we call a relapse, they go back and use because they really want to avoid these withdrawal symptoms. We want to reduce the cravings, and we want to make sure that this stopping of the use, the abstinence, is a long term. If you look at the treatment modalities, so I'm a pharmacologist, so I go for, you know, you treat with drugs, you treat with pharmacological treatment. But in neuropsych and definitely in addiction, this will never be enough. What's more important actually is all of the behavioral therapies, the motivation and motivational enhancement, the network, group, family therapy. This is really important. Medication comes really last because the reason the patient started using and continued using is there is an underlying issue. And unfortunately, if you do not address the underlying issue, this will become a recurrent problem. And it will be very hard for the patient to maintain that abstinence or stopping. So in summary, I just want to give a few messages. Addiction is a brain disease, and this is key. We have to treat it as a disease. We have to acknowledge that it is a disease. It's not a personality flaw. It's not that, no, it's a disease. Once it happens, it is a disease. But it is preventable because the behavior itself, the first behavior of substance use is a preventable behavior. And that's the key point. So when a patient becomes addicted, one of the best ways to make sure that the patient stays away from the substance is rebond with the society, rebond with the family and friends and society to make sure that that patient doesn't go back to the substance use. It is treatable, but it takes time. And when I say treatable is controlling these brain circuits that have been lit up in the brain. We cannot reverse many of the changes, but we can control them. This is the key when it comes to So after listening to this, I want you to go back and think about the first word that came to mind when, at the beginning, when we just had the title addiction. And now, after listening to this and knowing a little bit more about it, hopefully, maybe this changed, your idea or your perception of addiction. Thank you, and I will be happy to answer any questions if you have.
Thank you ever so much, Dr. Al-Alfi, for that very insightful presentation and information. It was very, very helpful and very educational as well. So thank you. We've had a couple of questions coming in. One of the questions, just backtracking through them a bit. When legalizing cannabis in the States, does that help tackling the problem or exaggerate it? I'm sure you get asked this question a lot, and it would be...
I mean, the reason I laugh is because this is actually my area of research. I've worked with cannabis for over 15 years now, and I work with cannabis from different aspects. I'm trying to actually to see its therapeutic value. And I understand the question. The problem with legalizing marijuana, so there are two aspects in the US. Legalizing marijuana recreationally versus the legal, medical marijuana. Unfortunately, or medical cannabis. The medical aspect of it, I mean, I'm just going to be totally blunt. I disagree with it because the reality is there's only one compound in cannabis that we know of that has this therapeutic value. And proven therapeutic value, and this compound this is THC, has already been approved by the FDA for certain applications. Now, legalizing marijuana, on the other hand, recreationally, it is unfortunate because initially the thought was, well, everybody is using it. It is being used, and why don't we just have it more accessible instead of the black market? And honestly, the drive for it was purely economic, because I know Colorado, which was one of the first states that legalized marijuana, I think like the first day they got in millions of dollars into the state because of legalizing marijuana. But what I'm seeing on the medical side is very different. For the first time in emergency rooms, we are seeing patients with major toxicity with marijuana. We haven't seen that before. Before its legalization, patients were not coming in with severe marijuana toxicity or marijuana poisoning. That was not the case. The problem is with the legalization, unfortunately, now on the market, we have marijuana that's like very high potency. When I worked with marijuana way back, like the highest potency we used was like 15%, which is like 15% of the main ingredient, THC. Now they are up to like 35, 40% of THC, which is the main psychoactive compound that's present in marijuana. And now we're seeing toxicity. We are seeing like hyperemesis, severe, the patients have like these chills, severe cold. So unfortunately, the legalization aggravated the problem that we're having with marijuana. The other piece is, and that's, you know, it's a different story, but like, I don't know if you guys have had this problem in the UK, but with the vaping and the e-cigarettes, we provided teenagers with the perfect device and tool to literally use anything. And here in the US, we have all of these teenagers, I'm talking middle school kids, who are using the vaping devices for marijuana. So now they have a nice device, and now we're having, unfortunately, more of these toxicity cases from it. We are seeing a trend going up for the use and experimentation with marijuana among teenagers. And the legalization actually, unfortunately, made it worse. Now, I'm not sure what's going on with the UK. I know that the UK legalized it, but it's not as bad as the US. I think people are still opposed to it. But I'll be happy to listen to what you guys think about that.
Thank you for that. It's very interesting to hear what you're saying there. And I'm guessing it does tie in quite interestingly with the next question as well, which is you're talking about the bond with the children and making sure that the children are well educated. So how do you propose that people go about doing that? Especially as you've mentioned, it's becoming the norm, it's becoming legal, it's becoming just another aspect of living in the Western world. So how would you approach that conversation with the children?
I mean, as a mom, my kids are old now, but I remember when they were going through their teenage years, and even before that, when they were in middle school, I started talking to them and their friends about it. I started talking to them, you know, I work in the field, so they kind of trust what I said. And it's not that I was scaring them away from it. I was just giving them the facts. I was relating to them what exactly happens. One of the things that I personally do, and you should reach out to the experts in your area. I used to go to middle and high school and high schools for my kids and actually talk to them about substance use and substance abuse in general. We used actually to bring some of previous addicts coming in. And you have to be careful because unfortunately, everything is available now. Everything is on the internet. I mean, there are like sites, websites with detailed, you know, DIY, how do you prepare this and how do you use it? Unfortunately, these are available for the kids. And no matter how hard you try to contain the exposure, it's not going to happen. They are exposed. It's better that they are informed. And it's better that they have this, you know, drive from the inside not to use it. There is a lot of peer pressure. So reach out to the experts in your community and invite them to go to schools, invite them to go to the middle, start early, start with the high school. Don't go to the little ones. Little ones can be scared, but at least start with middle school, all the way to high school. Keep that conversation going because they are bombarded with all of this all the time. I know, like when my kids in middle school, they were telling me about kids having, you know, pot joints in their lockers, and like I did not expect to hear about that. But definitely start the conversation. Provide them with the facts. Bring in people, unfortunately, who have been addicted and how addiction has affected their lives. Not just, you know, their health, but how it affected their social life, how it affected their interaction. We, at one point, we brought in a football player because, again, sports is a big deal. We brought in a football player who started in high school and he missed his chance of going to college and being able to actually practice and because of addiction. So it is important to try and counterbalance what the advertisement that they are seeing and the pull that unfortunately is available everywhere. You need to give them that other dark side, unfortunately, the dark side of it as well.
Thank you ever so much. That was quite interesting and insightful, especially the use of third parties and experts. I'm hoping that everyone listening is going to be taking a lot of notes on that topic. We have one other question, just kind of comparing what you are saying right now about life in the Western countries and life in the Middle East, and particularly life in Egypt and the Middle East. Does this mean that the drug problem or the drug abuse is more significant or more catastrophic in the Western world, or is it just more visible compared to how it is in the Middle East? Sorry, it's kind of a loaded question, so I do apologize.
No, it is. Well, I've been away from Egypt for like 28, 29 years now. So I do not know what the status is. But the comment in the question is very real. It's more visible here in the Western countries. I'm pretty sure it is there in Egypt. And unfortunately, because these substances are available everywhere. And the street drugs, their market is global. It doesn't really differentiate between Western countries versus other countries. So I'm pretty sure it is there in Egypt. And those of you maybe who visit Egypt more often or are more connected with Egypt or the Middle East might actually have a better handle of what's going on. But I do hear stories like from my friends who are living back home on how things are different now. Like compared to us when we were growing up, we didn't really get exposed. Like the maximum that people get exposed back then when I was still in middle school or high school was just people smoking cigarettes, right? We really didn't even hear about these other substances. But now I'm pretty sure they do. And again, the internet, social media, the changes that are happening in our Middle Eastern societies actually are exposing everybody. Regardless of where you are, they are being exposed to it. I do agree, it's more visible here because we talk about it more. But the reality is, I do think it's there. I don't have any numbers or any data to back this up. I'm just talking about, just from my experience talking to my friends who are living there. They are concerned because they see it among their kids' friends, and now, and the new generations are being more exposed. So definitely, the prevention should be for everybody, regardless of where you are. The only advantage they have living back home is you still have that big support family, your network, that more or less, we always tend to be, those who are similar, tend to flock together, right? Unfortunately, many times in the Western countries, when you're living far, you don't have the extended family and that support that helps you raise your kids and make sure, that they stay on the right track. So when you're living that far, you have to do the, extra double, triple, 100th duty to be everything for your kids, their extended family, that, you have to take that extra step to take that, to make that connections and make sure that they stay with that bonding so that they don't venture and try these substances.
It sounds like it's the foundation for a future research study comparing between the Middle East and the Western world.
That would be great. If someone actually has access to the data, that would be great.
In the interest of time, we do have just one final question, if you don't mind. And this question is revolving around supporting people to recover. There is a misconception in the community that some people are saying you need to have a substitute, so substitute the addicted drug with something else. However, the other side of the misconception is putting someone in a room, locking them up and giving them just food and water for a few weeks, that will help them recover from that. So if you could just please shed some light on that would be great.
Great question. So helping someone to recover requires multiple approaches. There isn't a single one approach that will help that patient. So let me talk about like the first one, like giving the medication or the substitute. This is actually a pharmacological approach. So when a patient is addicted to heroin, for example, what do? We actually give them methadone, which is an opioid. I mean, the methadone is an opioid. It basically does the same thing as heroin, not as intense, but it does the same thing. So why are we substituting heroin with methadone? Because we know that if you just stop the heroin suddenly, they will experience withdrawal. They are likely to go back and use it. So you want to make sure that you ease the experience a little bit. Plus, when you're substituting with methadone, you can gradually taper the dose. You start with a certain dose, but then gradually you can lower it. So you get the body gradually acclimated to being drug-free. That's the whole point. That's the whole point of the pharmacological treatment or the substitute. You don't want to do it cold turkey. Suddenly the body is not seeing that substance at all. Instead, you're doing it gradually to help the patient, adapt, and at the same time to help the body, kind of like reverse a little bit or with these changes. So that's one thing. Locking them up in one room and just giving them food and water, this defies the idea of these patients. Number one, we acknowledge that this is a disease, right? So a patient with diabetes, you don't just lock them up in a room and tell them, just take your medication and we'll give you what you need and that's done. The main problem in these patients is bonding. They need to bond. If you give them the impression that you're an outcast, I'm just gonna lock you up here until you get over it, no, that's the wrong message to these patients. That aggravates the problem. The hardest issue that most of these patients have is just fitting back into the society after being labeled as an addict. And starting the recovery process by outcasting them is not really a good idea. You need to give them the support. Yes, they need to be able to, to stop it, but don't leave them alone. They need that support. They need people to be with them. They need to be able to talk about it. They need to be able to, yes, they are experiencing the withdrawal. It's going to be nasty, but don't leave them alone in this. You need that support. The other piece is this: when you do this, yeah, maybe they stop using, but guess what? The first time they see a trigger, they will relapse, and that's the problem. And that's why it needs a longitudinal approach. You can't just do it once. They need to be in therapy. They need the behavioral therapy. They need the psychological management and treatment. They need dealing with their family and friends and rebonding with them to make sure that they do not relapse. It's not just a matter of stopping using. It's making sure that they maintain that. Otherwise, they will relapse.
Fantastic. Thank you ever so much, Dr. Abir Al-Alfi, for your time with us today. It is really appreciated. It sounds like hopefully there could be another talk about this particular topic in the future. Thank you ever so much once again. And for those who are listening, please do check out the videos on YouTube.
Perfect. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.
Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you in the next session. Don't hesitate to follow us on our social media platforms as seen on this screen. For more updates and information on the Egyptians Together Union, please visit our official website on www.egyptianstogether.com. Also, for any questions or queries, please contact us via email on egyptianstogetheruk@gmail.com. Also, for more videos, please subscribe to our YouTube channel called Egyptians Together. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you in the next session.